3 p.m. on the East Coast, so thank you all for being here today. You are in the Helping Current and Former Incarcerated in College. So thank you all for being here today. As you all know, this session is being recorded and we will be sending out the recording with the PowerPoint materials within a week of this session. We do have to chop off the beginning and get everything ready. So it does take us a little bit to get it out, but just note that we are recording this session and it will be sent to you. Another thing to note is that, yes, you do have the chat option to be able to communicate with us. And then you do have the Q&A feature as well. So please place all of your questions into the Q&A box because that is the order in which we will be answering them. If you put them in the chat, they'll probably get lost. And we definitely want to make sure that we answer all of your questions. So without further ado, I am going to take the time to introduce your amazing panelists that took the time out of their day to be here with all of you to share more information. So this is just a little bit about them. So I'll go ahead and start with Rachel. So Rachel is the Assistant Director of Federal Relations at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, NASFAA. She contributes to NASFAA's policy and advocacy efforts, representing the association before congressional members and staff, and working to enhance the advocacy capacity of its members. Prior to joining NASFAA, Rachel worked in higher education policy and analysis and research at the Institute for Higher Education Policy and Center for American Progress. She began her career in higher education as a college advisor with the Carolina College Advising Corps, where she worked at 2 public high schools in Northern California, assisting low-income and first-generation students navigating the college application and financial aid process. Rachel holds a master's degree in higher education from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a bachelor's degree in public policy and psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So that is a little bit about Rachel. We'll go ahead and can everyone see the panelists? I think I have it in the appropriate view where you can see the whole gallery. So we'll go ahead and move over to Catherine Farrell. For nearly 8 years, she worked with incarcerated individuals at the Washington State Penitentiary as an instructor for the DOC mandated basic skills curriculum and as a transition specialist for a local nonprofit organization. The transition specialist position was primarily tasked with assisting incarcerated persons prepare to continue their education in their releasing communities. When funding sources were diverted to new projects, she returned to college herself, attending John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. She graduated with a Master's of Public Administration, emphasis on criminal justice policy and administration, and in 2019, a Master's of Arts in Criminal Justice, emphasis on criminology and deviance in 2020. During that time, she assisted with combined courses where campus students worked with incarcerated students at the penitentiary, exploring applied ethics scenarios that culminated in a public forum. Next is Sheila. Oh my goodness, please help me say your name. Is it Meeman?
It's Myman.
Myman. Okay, Sheila Myman is the director of the Raritan Valley Community College, also known as RVCC RISE, Returning and Incarcerated Student Education Program in New Jersey, which offers an associate degree in liberal arts inside the New Jersey State Correctional Facilities. RVCC began offering a degree inside these facilities in 2010 and was selected as a second chance Pell site in 2016. Professor Myman has taught mathematics at RVCC since 2015. She holds a bachelor's degree from the Carnegie Mellon University, as well as a Master's of Science in Engineering from Purdue University. She holds a master's certificate in program project management from American University in their Vanguard series NJBIZ, named the professor one of the 2018 leaders in higher education in New Jersey. Next is Joe Luis Hernandez, a formerly incarcerated student currently working on a PhD at Claremont Graduate University in the School of Education Studies. His research focuses on the strengths that formerly incarcerated students possess as a result of their lived experience with incarceration, gang membership, or addiction. He grew up all over Los Angeles, moving between areas such as Watts, Southgate, El Centro, or El Sereno. At a young age, he began to get involved with drugs and the street lifestyle that follows, consisting of gangs, violence, and incarceration. Educationally, Joe is a two-time high school dropout that was stuck in 10th grade for 3 years, ultimately graduating from home studies. At the age of 19, he was incarcerated for the first time. Once released, he began to spend various weekends in and out of police custody until he was resentenced once again to jail time. Once released, he was ordered to attend a drug treatment center that introduced him to higher education, where he attended Mount San Antonio College for the first time, where he dropped out. He then worked menial labor jobs due to his criminal background until his mother pushed him to enroll at Mount SAC once again. During this second time at school, he met his mentor, Diana Felix, who pushed him to aspire to transfer to a four-year university. Since going back to school, Joe has earned his associate's degree, a bachelor's degree from CSU LA, and a master's degree from CSU LB. In student development and higher education, where his thesis, "You are about to witness the strength of street knowledge, how formerly incarcerated Latinx students transfer their knowledge acquired through their lived experiences to find success in higher education and build resiliency," set off his research career. While at CSU LB, he assisted in the founding of Rising Scholars, Irene Sotelo, Adrian Vasquez, and Dr. James Benal, to support another formerly incarcerated student. He worked for Rio Hondo College in the Student Equity Office, supporting other formerly incarcerated students through the Rise Scholars Program, which he assisted in the development. He also serves as the inaugural program coordinator for Mount San Antonio College's Rising Scholars Program for system-impacted students. He has served in a variety of advising and counseling roles for formerly incarcerated students and has a wealth of experience working in the community college system. As a formerly incarcerated student himself, his lived experiences have helped shape his advocacy and scholarship. He is a member of the NASFAA, formerly incarcerated students and system-impacted families knowledge community. So far, Joe Luis has co-authored 3 scholarly articles, various scholarly presentations, and 2 book chapters. Next is Diana Felix. Diana Felix has 18 years of experience in higher education, serving low-income and first-generation college students. Since 2011, she serves as the faculty counselor coordinator at Mount San Antonio College for the ACES program, a TRIO student support service program that assists low-income, first-generation, and/or disabled students to obtain an associate's degree and transfer to a four-year institution. Prior to Mount SAC, she worked at Pasadena City College and then CSU Long Beach for Upward Bound programs. At Mount SAC, Diana has coordinated and led a financial literacy initiative since 2011 to establish financial literacy awareness for all Mount SAC students through interactive workshops and events. In 2013, she organized students in STEM fields at Mount SAC to initiate a chapter for the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers that has been successful in supporting students in STEM majors. Diana is a Mount SAC alumnus who transferred to UC Santa Barbara and attained her bachelor's degree in sociology and her master's degree from CSU Long Beach in counseling, student development, and higher education. So that is your panel. And I will go ahead and start, or I believe, Rachel, since you are first, do you want to go ahead and start your slides, and then I'll pick up after that.
Yes.
So welcome everybody, and thank you for being with us.
Great. I will share my screen. Okay, can you all see my slides? Great. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. As you all can see, this is a pretty amazing panel. I feel like I'm the least impressive person. There's just so many great perspectives, and I'm excited to be with you all and have a great conversation. So before I dive in, I wanted to just give a brief overview of who NASFAA is for those of you who aren't familiar with us. NASFAA represents more than 28,000 student financial aid professionals at roughly 3,000 colleges and universities across the country. So our members are the folks on college campuses that are responsible for administering financial aid, helping students through the aid application process, so filling out FAFSAs, navigating eligibility issues that might arise. And I imagine many of you all may work closely with the NASFAA members who work in the financial aid offices on your campuses. And I think relevant to this discussion, many of our members have been involved in some way, shape, or form with the Second Chance Pell program, have played a part in some capacity in the administration of Pell grants for students who are participating in the experimental sites. Sheila is one of our members, so I'm glad to have the financial aid person on the call or on the Zoom. And yeah, with that, we'll dive in. So as I mentioned earlier, you heard during the introductions, we have a fantastic panel of practitioners. And my role today is really just to give kind of a brief overview of some legislation that was passed in December, passed by Congress, signed into law in December. And I'm going to try to be brief because I want to make sure that the experiences and the perspectives of the other folks are really what we spend most of our time doing. And before I take a deep dive into the legislation that was signed into law in December, I do think it's important to give a very, very high level overview of the background and history of Pell eligibility as it relates to incarcerated students, just to kind of contextualize what this new bill means in terms of post-secondary access and success. So the Pell Grant program, as many of you probably know, was authorized in 1965 in the Higher Education Act. That bill, as I'm sure most of you are aware, established a whole slew of federal regulations around higher education and established the Pell Grant program as kind of the cornerstone of the federal student aid program. In 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which you may hear referred to as the 1994 Crime Bill or the Clinton Crime Bill, was passed, and that was a pretty expansive piece of legislation that dealt with crime and law enforcement. And in that bill, there was a ban implemented and that ban prohibited individuals in state and federal prisons from receiving Pell Grants. So this 1994 Pell ban, really greatly barred and restricted college access for incarcerated students. Following the passage of the bill, the number of education programs in prisons dropped substantially. I think it was roughly 350 in 1990 prior to the ban, and then that number shrunk to only really a handful, around a dozen in 2005. So the impact of that 1994 ban just really can't be, I think, overstated in terms of how it impacted college access and post-secondary education opportunities for incarcerated students. Because without access to Pell Grants, while a handful of programs remained, really just programs that were funded through private or foundation funding were the ones that were able to remain. So moving on, kind of another thing that I think is important to note is that in 2014, the Department of Education published guidance that clarified that individuals in local and county jails and juvenile justice facilities were eligible for Pell Grants. So that's kind of a distinction within this population. And then lastly, finally, what you all may be most familiar with is that in 2015, the Department of Education launched the Second Chance Pell Initiative, which allowed for what we call experimental sites to provide Pell Grants to individuals in state and federal prisons. So the first Second Chance Pell cohort included 63 colleges that were teaching in facilities in, I believe it was 26 states. Back in April of 2020, the department announced an expansion of this program to include a second cohort of schools. That was 67 new schools. So that brought the total number of schools participating to 130, located in 42 states and the District of Columbia. And I think some folks on the call will be able to speak to this in better than I can, but I would say overwhelmingly the results and the data and the impact of the pilot have been overwhelmingly positive and have really demonstrated that post-secondary education in prison contributes to successful reentry and to, really just wonderful outcomes for the students who participated in the pilot. Second Chance Pell institutions have enrolled nearly 17,000 students over 3 years. Students have earned more than 4,500 certificates, diplomas, and degrees. And like I said, I think some of the folks who will speak a little later can really contextualize in more lived experiences what this program has really meant. Okay, so with that context in mind, I want to talk about the big change that happened in December. So the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 was a very large bill. It included funding for government funding for fiscal year 21. It included COVID relief funding, and then it also included the FAFSA Simplification Act, which was a handful of higher education provisions. It included FAFSA simplification and some changes to the way Pell grants are determined. But I think most notably for this conversation is that the bill repealed the ban on Pell eligibility for incarcerated students that was put in place in the 1994 bill that I mentioned earlier. So given the impact that the ban has had on college access over the last couple of decades, this repeal of the ban and the restoration of Pell eligibility for incarcerated students really is a huge win and what I think all of us on the call believe is going to be really transformational in terms of the access and to post-secondary opportunities that incarcerated students will be experiencing once it's implemented. So the bill, as I said, repeals the ban. That's kind of the top line, but I think we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive. The legislation includes some requirements around institutional and program eligibility. So what the requirements that colleges and the programs they are providing and are offering in prisons have to meet in order to do so. And then also some requirements around student eligibility. So the requirements that students themselves would have to meet to be eligible to receive a Pell Grant. The bill, I think this is a question we've been getting a lot. Once it passed, we're all very excited. And so the first question is, well, when is this going to take place? And the bill has an implementation date of July 1 of 2023. But the legislation also gives the Department of Education the authority to implement early if they would like to do so. They're not required to, but the secretary is given kind of just the discretion to decide to opt for an early implementation. It kind of remains to be seen what's going to happen. As you all know, was a presidential transition this year, so the department is, there's new people that are at the department. They're kind of getting their feet under them. I think we'll hopefully be learning more about what implementation will look like and what the timeline might look like. So I think in general, there's a lot to kind of be determined around what the implementation, how it will go, what will happen, what it'll look like. But I think especially with the timing and when we see these provisions really go into effect, we're just going to have to kind of wait and see. But July 1, 2023 is kind of the deadline to get these things implemented. So as I mentioned, there are some requirements around student eligibility. So the law itself defines, quote, confined or incarcerated individuals with the following definition. This is pulled from the bill text. Means an individual who is serving a criminal sentence in a federal, state, or local penal institution, prison, jail, reformatory, work farm, or other similar correctional institution, and does not include an individual who is in a halfway house or home detention or sentenced to serve only weekends. So that is the definition of confined or incarcerated individual in the legislation. I think one thing that's really important to note is that the bill did not include any eligibility carve-outs or sentencing requirements. So there had been previous legislation that had been proposed in Congress by various members that were related to restoring Pell eligibility for incarcerated students. And some of those proposals had included certain kind of restrictions around which students would be eligible for Pell. So maybe depending on the student sentencing. So some proposals would have only restored eligibility for students who weren't serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. That was something that the higher ed and prison community, NASFAA included, really pushed to not have included in the final bill. Really felt like this should be a full restoration. There should not be certain populations of students that are kind of prohibited from receiving Pell, given the, kind of from a social justice perspective, but also just the positive impact that we know that these programs have on students of all backgrounds and of all circumstances. So that I think is really exciting that there aren't any eligibility restrictions or carve-outs included in the bill. And then other than that, students must enroll in an eligible prison education program, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a minute. And they also must fulfill just other general Pell Grant and Title IV eligibility requirements. So these are the same eligibility requirements that all students must meet to receive federal student aid. So things like completing a FAFSA, having a high school diploma or equivalency, not having a Title IV, so federal student loan in default, being a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. Again, these are kind of the Section 484 of the Higher Education Act eligibility requirements that any student has to meet, and that continues to apply. One thing I will mention is that there's currently requirements related to students who are required to register for selective service, having to do so in order to be eligible for federal student aid. There's also a requirement related to students and limiting eligibility for students with drug convictions. And both of those I think have been really challenging during Second Chance Pell. But the good news is that those two questions on the FAFSA, as well as their tie to eligibility, are both were both removed in the legislation that passed in December, which I think across the board for all students is a win and something that we at NASFAA really pushed for and advocated for. But specifically for this population, we're excited that once this restoration is implemented, the challenges related to selective service and drug convictions will no longer be existing. So it's a great thing. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about institutional eligibility and the requirements that schools and programs have to meet in order to offer prison education programs once Pell restoration is implemented. So proprietary institutions, so for-profit institutions, are not eligible. That was something that was included in the bill. So only public and private nonprofit institutions may operate prison education programs receiving Pell Grant funding. Institutions must also not have had any severe action taken by the Department of Education, by the state they're located in, or by accreditors within the previous 5-year period. Programs must be approved by the State Department or Corrections or the Federal Bureau of Prisons, whichever is applicable. State or programs must ensure that their academic credits from the programs that they're offering transfer to at least one institution in the state where the prison is located, so that if a student were to be released and have taken courses inside, they'd be able to transfer those to an institution in their state. Programs must meet applicable licensure requirements in the state. So if a student is enrolled in a program that's going to require licensure, they have to make sure that the program itself is fulfilling the requirements to obtain that licensure. And then programs must fulfill their annual reporting requirements. One thing I don't have on the slide, but I wanted to mention is another question we've been hearing a lot is, what about Second Chance Pell? So we've got this full restoration, which again is something we've all really pushed for and advocated for. Second Chance Pell was always intended to be an experiment. It was not intended to necessarily be something that spanned for decades. It was kind of a pilot to see what this looked like and how it kind of played out. And now that we have the bill passed in December, we're at full restoration of eligibility. It's a great thing, but kind of what is this transition going to look like? So I think one thing I mentioned is that Second Chance Pell and the bill that passed in December, the FAFSA Simplification Act, the student eligibility requirements and many of the institutional eligibility requirements looked similar. And the bill itself in December is silent on Second Chance Pell. It doesn't actually mention what this transition will look like. So I think it just sort of remains to be seen what the department will do with Second Chance Pell as we implement this new legislation. And they eventually could stop it, they could continue it, they could expand it. Some folks on the call may have more to share on this, but I think my main takeaway is just that we're kind of still, just like we're waiting to see how this bill is implemented, we're sort of waiting to see what the overlap and the transition between the pilot and full restoration looks like. And there may be a period of overlap, but we'll just kind of have to wait and see. So with the context of the new bill in mind, I just wanted to close by discussing some kind of general areas and categories that institutions who are currently serving currently and formerly incarcerated students, or schools that are considering developing new programs to serve these populations, what they may be or should be considering as they think about serving this population. And I wanted to give the caveat that although we just discussed this new bill that expands Pell eligibility for currently incarcerated students, it's also critically important to ensure that institutions are working to serve and support formerly incarcerated students through reentry, through removing barriers that these students may face as they're enrolling in classes and navigating campuses and their courses once they've been released. And again, you'll hear from some great experts on the panel who are doing amazing work in this area. And so these considerations on this slide are largely applicable, I think, to both serving both current and formerly incarcerated students. And of course, there are differences in the specific challenges facing these populations. But I do think that, largely these kind of apply to both populations. And it's just really critical that campus policy and practice and the development of programs are done so in a way that's really aimed at serving this population, it's strategic and it's thoughtful. So the first bucket of considerations that I wanted to mention is deciding just where responsibilities lie within the institution. I know this was something that has been talked about with Second Chance Pell, is who on campus is going to be supporting this population? Where will these students go? Is there a specific staff member dedicated to supporting this population? Is there a specific campus office or entity? How are responsibilities going to be divided on campus? So there's a lot to think about. There's a lot of kind of institutional policies, things like how do you handle disruptions in enrollment for an incarcerated student, or how do you navigate the process of getting approved by the state, developing a memorandum of understanding with the state. So that's the first one. The second is student recruitment. And I think to kind of elaborate on what I mean by that, how are we providing students with information on their options, on the programs that are available to them, the availability of financial aid, on what their post-release employment opportunities might be. I think particularly for currently incarcerated students who have limited access to internet and to research these programs on their own, thinking through how are we providing students with information to let them know what their options are, what those options might translate to in terms of future opportunities, and also ensuring that our recruitment practices are equitable and are providing access to all students who are interested in obtaining post-secondary credentials, and being really strategic in how we're crafting those policies and related to admissions. Third is support for FAFSA completion and verification. So I think this is particularly us at NASFAA, one of the main things that we've been thinking about a lot is how for currently incarcerated students who may not have access to internet or to a computer to fill out the online FAFSA, it can be very challenging in a prison context without that internet access. So ensuring that students have the support they need to complete the FAFSA, are able to access their personal and their family records, income documentation, resolving any eligibility issues that pop up. So that's definitely a big bucket, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing at NASFAA to think through these things. Student support services. I know this is of interest to everyone on this call, and I'm really excited to hear from our other panelists who I think will have a lot of great things to share. But incarcerated students, formerly incarcerated students, are just that. They're students, and they need academic planning and academic support, tutoring, career support, career advising, just like all other students. And so thinking through how do the programs that schools are developing ensure that they're providing the same level of student support to these students as they would for any other student. I also throw in there like class registration, making sure that credits are transferable, and you're planning to help students if they're going to be reentering or released, how are those credits going to transfer to another institution. And I think very related to student support is access to course materials, books, supplies, making sure that students have the resources they need to do research, to finish their homework, to be able to study. And I think the folks on the call are going to have a lot of good things to share related to this. Next, reentry support for students who have been released. So ensuring that a student who is released and maybe wants to maintain their enrollment at the same institution or transfer their credits to a different institution, use their degree or credential to enter the workforce, making sure that students are supported through that process. So this may mean having a process to allow students to access their transcripts, ensuring that degrees and transcripts for this population looks the same as for any other student and doesn't denote where the courses were taken. I know that's one that we've heard mentioned quite a bit. Second to last, I think staff training, education, and professional development is critically important in ensuring that we're providing the folks on our campuses who are going to be working to support this population with any type of training, professional development to understand the experiences and the challenges of currently and formerly incarcerated students. It I think is really important in kind of the culture of care that we want to show to this population. And then lastly, student privacy protections. This is something that's come up a lot in our discussions with NASFAA members as we think about implementation and ensuring that incarcerated students' privacy and their personal information is protected. That's a big part of kind of financial aid in general. So I wanted to close with that one. Lastly, I'll just mention that for all of your information, NASFAA has a working group. We're calling it the Pell Restoration Working Group. And we are just taking kind of a close look at some of the challenges specifically related to FAFSA completion that were really illuminated during Second Chance Pell, some of the challenges that we already know about, some things that may arise once we see the full implementation of Pell eligibility for incarcerated students. And we're working on developing recommendations and best practices. So hopefully this report will be out later this summer. And happy to offline with anyone who wants to know more about it. But just wanted to mention that we are kind of thinking through what the financial aid side of implementation will look like, and we're very excited to see where it goes. So with that, that's all I have. I'm not sure, I'm gonna see who is next, but is it Catherine? Awesome. Well, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and happy to take questions at the end. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rachel. So hello from Washington State. My name is Catherine Farrell. I spent about 8 years working at the Washington State Penitentiary in dual roles. I worked for a corrections education program that was managed by the local community college, as well as a transition specialist for a local nonprofit. And the funding sources for those programs were different. The education program in Washington State has increasingly been through state allocation dollars, but also our particular program was privately funded for a number of years. And then the nonprofit, actually, my position was funded by a settlement through a lawsuit that involved incarcerated persons. I think that my position was unique in that the majority of my time was spent working with groups of incarcerated individuals, either in workshops or the classroom setting, as well as a number of one-on-one appointments so that individual care and advising with people who are interested in continuing education. And after about 4.5 years, I think that the data had showed that I'd sat with more than 1,500 individuals. The information that I'm going to share in this is more experience-based than evidence-based, partly due because it's difficult to gather data, scientifically based data for incarcerated populations, like Rachel said, with privacy concerns. And then throughout this presentation, I'm going to pose some questions just to get you thinking about if you're administering a program of education in prison. These should maybe be things that you're thinking about. So next slide, please. There are some strong overlaps between students who are incarcerated and students who would qualify for TRIO support. The Prison Policy Initiative found that incarcerated persons had a median annual income of about $19,000 prior to their incarceration, which is about 41% less than non-incarcerated people of the same age. In 2003, the Bureau of Justice found that 18% of the general population does not have high school equivalency, but 40% of adult correctional population does not have high school equivalency. And while half of the general population has some post-secondary education, it was closer to 13% for the adult correctional population that had some form of or partial post-secondary experience. But I will say, at least from my experience, that many of them already had issues with defaulted aid by the time they were incarcerated. And it was far more likely for the incarcerated population to have done an alternative route for high school equivalency, like the GED. So those considerations, as well as, and this gets a little tricky, but the Center for American Progress has found that people in state and federal prisons are 3 times more likely to report having at least one disability. And that there's approximately 40% of the population also reports having chronic health issues, which can also affect ambulatory abilities. In addition, about a third of the youth who are in correctional facilities are eligible for special education programs, and 40% of adults in correctional facilities have they self-disclose that they have a disability, whether it's officially diagnosed or not. And most of those disabilities tend to lean towards learning disabilities. As well as, I think it's important to note that approximately 6 million children are impacted by parental incarceration. And so in summary, the corrections facilities have a higher concentration of individuals who are low income, who qualify as first-generation college students, and who could be diagnosed with a disability. Additionally, I want to just kind of touch on the fact that the technical aspect of disability diagnosis is complex due to the fact that the transience of youth. So they're either moving from school to school, there's behavioral punishments that have limited their access to services, they've dropped out, or they're meeting the minimal equivalencies through alternative routes like GED. And this matters because, at least for me, the disability support that I saw in prison was reliant on school records, previous school records. And so if there was no record, then it was very difficult to get any sort of support, official support for like accommodations for GED testing and that sort of thing. And then, of course, there's also some, unequal access to medical care, which can affect individuals who have hearing or vision difficulties. And that's compounded in a correctional facility. So one question that I would pose is, recognizing the prevalence of disabilities, whether they're diagnosed or not, how will your institution support these students if you're running a program in the prison? Other factors that affect student success, it's going to be similar as to the main campuses, but they can look like parental absence, changing custodial situations, state interventions, as well as adoption, including foreign adoption and refugee status, which there was a proportion of this population that I saw who were incarcerated as adults. And I want to emphasize that the interrupted family structure has a compounding effect, okay? Besides having the stress of basic needs at the time, in the adult years, it also influences your concepts of self and developing identity, which it just affects in a lot of ways your ability to learn and where you see where you are in the world. I also expect that the audience knows this already, but I want to make sure to mention that hand in hand with the home and the community instability are conditions that result in trauma, including vulnerability to abuse and neglect, as well as the resulting health conditions that can affect mental and physical well-being. Trauma affects not only one's ability to learn, but also one's outlook on life. So the amount of hope one has that, or will be able to believe that things can be different than they are now. So next slide. Thanks. Once incarceration begins, the overwhelming expectation of daily living is submission and compliance. And so in many ways, this is contrary to the classroom experience that we're trying to foster, where we want students to be curious and questioning and debate. That is not the environment of corrections. Institutionalization involves limiting the number of choices that one has, and most actions inside a correctional facility require some form of permission. The safety first principle, which is necessary in that sort of environment, establishes like a regimented manner of operation. So movements between events and activities of daily living follow a rigid schedule. For example, access to showers and phones are limited to certain timeframes. Participation in programming is required, at least in Washington state, but individuals are subjected to a vetting process and institutional priorities based on formulas. So there is some limited to access. Throughout these movements and events, management and authority changes with each staff person who's assigned, and that can be by the location in the facility, the time of day, and the day of the week. And most importantly about this, the condition of movement between these activities, like going to class, is going to be influenced by the discretion of the staff involved. Variances of what is allowed contributes to inconsistency, which can be stressful, even under these operation directives. So whether you can bring your pens and pencils from your cell to the classroom, how many pieces of paper you can carry with you, whether you're allowed to put them in a folder, all of these things can change on a daily basis. And so try to imagine, the stress that could incur. One example I was thinking of is that if you go to the grocery store and you're ready to check out and the checker starts throwing your fruit down the belt and then, puts your chips in and then throws the cans of soup on top. And, you imagine how irritated you're going to be by then. And then imagine trying to go to class after that. For many of our students, they run into these sort of stressors and they can't choose the checker. I mean, they're just having to go through the movement as it's assigned. And the other thing to consider too is that, and based on safety, management is also ruled by suspicion. And so if you come back to class to your cell, which is your home, and somebody somewhere has suggested that there's something going on, there can be a cell search and all of your property is subject to confiscation, which can mean either it's temporarily removed or it's thrown out. And I've had students who have lost books, research materials, all sorts of, everything that could be related to their classroom success could be gone in an instant without being able to retrieve it. And worse still is, depending on the seriousness of the suspicion, they can also be removed to another part of the facility, like segregation, where access is very limited. They don't have any of their property, and their attendance is interrupted. So, one of the questions I would ask if you're thinking about running a program is, how are you going to support these students who have their attendance interrupted, their programming interrupted? And I think Rachel kind of touched on that just for a minute. And so, next slide. Most main campuses work to support students in developing their skill set, time management, coping with stress, test taking and anxiety, that's kind of skill set. But what I've also seen in the prison environment is the need to address punitive academic experience. And that manifests itself in disdain for forced education programming, which in Washington, you have to, very few exceptions, but you have to have high school equivalency at a minimum. But programming overall is mandated for incarceration. There's a fear of asking questions, especially asking for help. There's a fear of disclosing problems like vision problems. And there's also difficulties remedying those problems like lost or broken glasses, materials, say from a cell search, and that kind of thing. And in addition, addressing any sort of defaulted aid, which of course is going to affect the Pell eligibility that people are going to talk about. In addition, making sure that your staffing is key. And I know Sheila's going to address this later in terms of a model for success. But I would caution blurring the roles of hiring custody staff for adjunct instructors, which is something that I have witnessed in my institution. So that gets a bit tricky. And then I also, my experience with the students is that it takes an incredible amount of fortitude and patience to be successful and to continue through these processes, navigating these bureaucracies, both the Department of Corrections as well as the higher education. And another question I would ask is, how will you support students in their dreams when every day they are presented with evidence that wanting a better life is futile? Next slide. Most of the work, I guess it went ahead. So most of the work that I provided fell into the category of transfer support. So helping prepare incarcerated students for continuing education when they released. And I know that a lot of that's going to be covered by the next panelists and such. So I won't touch on it too much, except to really emphasize the need to begin that process while the students are still incarcerated. It's complex, and there's lots of complications that I saw students having to navigate. In addition to the regular admissions and financial aid processes, there were also the exterior barriers like child support obligations and driver's license status, as well as the selective service, which was earlier addressed, and taxes. We can't forget about filing taxes for people who have had very varied income histories. In addition, I would provide a lot of this support, but I had to do it as a demonstration because the students are not, at least in Washington, they were not allowed on the internet. They were not allowed to access my computer. And so a lot of this stuff was, at least they were introduced to the process, but relied on me to, do a number of the different types of filings and things. Digital literacy and e-filing skills were very low for a number of reasons. And then the other thing is which will also be talked about in depth, is just the expectations of if you're under supervision when you get out, which are also at the discretion of the officers involved. And I just want to say that, I had one student who got in contact with me. He was on community supervision, and some of the violations can include you're not allowed to consort with another previously incarcerated person. And this individual was talking to me about the frustration he felt that he and another individual who was previously incarcerated were waiting for the bus and got hauled off back to the community corrections office because of this, this proximity. And they were waiting for the bus to go to campus for class. So, part of the institutional problems in terms of trying to support students, these are things to keep in mind. And the last thing I'll just close with real quickly is that one of the hardest things that I have had to find, but one of the most important things that I have found in the work is to respect the agency of the individual. At any time, students may decide that they need to either temporarily halt or permanently end their education. And it's incredibly important that we, in support of them, provide them with as much accurate information as possible and to complete the processes in the least punitive manner possible. And the reason is this: it may not be a matter of retention and graduation for that individual, but their experience with education is going to greatly affect the influence that they have on all of the people they're connected with in terms of whether those individuals continue education as well. And this can be their children and their grandchildren. So So, regardless of maybe some of the measurements that we would have as a higher education institution in terms of success rates, there's also a far more complex human element to it. So, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to try to not repeat anything that's been said, but give you an idea what it's like operating one of these programs. We've been a second chance Pell College, which means we had the privilege of administering financial aid for students who are incarcerated since 2016, but we've been teaching inside since 2010. So I've sort of grown up in this program. Could we drop the slides maybe? They'll go out with this, but they're bullet points to remind me of what I want to talk about. So basically, when you are operating one of these programs, you have to keep a couple guiding thoughts in mind. One is that you're going back to the future in not a good way. Many, many, many programs inside are paper enabled, not internet enabled. And so if you think about a way a college administered itself 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, that's the kind of world you're stepping back into now. And many of us at colleges today don't have those old processes or the old staff available to do processes in the manner in which they used to be done. And that makes it really challenging to kick one of these programs off. And from a student perspective, the fact that students have a lack of independent information access is massive. We send our students off to look things up, to research things, to register, to do all kinds of functions while they're pre-student, while they're in-student, and while they're post-student. And many, if not most of our students inside just don't have that access to information. Another guiding thought is we're going to be, if you operate a program like this, you're going to be standing there in the middle of two institutions that have incredibly rigid processes. Colleges and universities, we've got the Department of Education in the federal and state that we answer to. We have our accreditors that we answer to. We have all kinds of processes and laws and FERPAs and all kinds of things that we have to do to maintain our accreditation. The Department of Corrections has its own set of rules, but it doesn't have the same mission we do as a school. And so when you have two schools with two institutions with really strong, rigid processes and not the same mission, you're going to continually have to work out the tension between the two and find a common ground that lets you serve the students. And that's one thing to say, it's a lot harder to do. And I think it requires some level of partnership between the school and the Department of Corrections, some level of trust building to start to happen so that we trust that they'll let us actually properly and independently and academically soundly teach a class. And they trust that we won't be sneaking bad things inside or stirring up problems inside. And that takes some time to build that trust. Any of these programs have to focus continually on equity. That sounds easy, but when you think about the world of recruitment, even just start with recruiting students. How are you going to recruit them? Are you going to let the Department of Corrections nominate people? Is that going to be their process? Are you going to find ways to make sure that the kind of equity you place on admissions for your outside students work inside? And you can look at it too from a pure equity perspective as far as diversity, because I know in New Jersey, we have a very bad, in fact, it's the nation's worst mismatch between our population outside and our population inside as far as racial demographics. We incarcerate a much higher percentage of people of color than you would expect given our population as a whole. And so when I look at my program, I look at diversity metrics continually to make sure that I'm not having the profile of my student body look like the state does, but rather make sure that I'm giving people who are incarcerated a blend that more closely matches the institution, if not better. So for instance, right now, I would say, I think it's about 81%, maybe it's 82% of my student body are people of color. I typically run about 500 students every semester, and I run 3 semesters a year. So it's not a metric that a college is going to ask you to necessarily separate out and think about, but it's important if you're running a program. I think we also have to realize that the return of Pell is all about financial aid eligibility, but that's not going to be enough to open a program. The way we view it when we took our program inside, and every college is a little different, but we operate it as a micro college. So all of the functions that sit in what we call College Center here at Raritan Valley, we have to transport those functions inside. And you're obviously not taking everybody from all of those offices into prisons. You can't clear that many people to go inside, but you have to build a micro college mentality so that you're taking the functions, the expertise, and the supports of a college inside with you when you're operating a program inside. So you have to look at the definition of your program, which is something your provost often will be looking at in your college. Are you going to be doing workforce education, transfer degrees? What modality, certificate programs? What modality are you going to teach in? Are you going to be a distance program, or are you a face-to-face campus? And are you going to be able to do that inside also? We do face-to-face exclusively. Those are big global decisions you have to make when you're building a program. Even things like the application. It's been a long time since any student on the street applied to Raritan Valley in any manner other than going online and filling out our application. That doesn't work. I have no technology inside. So we had to dig out and redevelop an old paper form as an application. And we had to simplify it a little so that we weren't asking questions that people who were inside would find irrelevant to answer. I don't need an email address. They don't have an email address, for instance. And we've had to do that with every step through. So with financial aid, you've got one big decision to make. If you have students who can be admitted to your program, have the academic qualifications, and they cannot receive financial aid, and there are many reasons people cannot. It's not just about their income. They could have an old defaulted loan from 30 years ago, and that's going to stop them from getting financial aid. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to admit them and find a way to cover their tuition, either through philanthropic funding, through scholarships from your college, through other mechanisms? Or are you going to say, I'll only educate people who are able to receive Pell? That's a big decision at the macro level you have to make going into this. Are you going to give them an orientation? What's that going to look like? I mean, right now on campus, our orientation's on the web. I can't do that. And the orientation on the web isn't something that would make sense for people inside, because it talks about what days of the week the lunchtime club meetings are across campus. That doesn't fit in my inside program. How in the world are you going to do degree advising? On campus, again, my students go into my campus ERP, where we happen to be a banner school, but it applies for any. And we have other tools that students on campus can use to figure out where they're at in their degree progression. Students inside don't have that. So we've had to develop paper product that we maintain manually that tells them this is the major you're in, this is your progress so far, because it's more than just a transcript. How does that map to a degree? And you've got to do that manual mapping. We have a lending library on campus. Our students can't go to the bookstore inside, nor do they have the funds to do it, nor does my program, which runs, we run in arrears quite a bit. We don't have the money to buy brand new books every semester and leave them inside. So we run a lending library, and we go buy decent quality used textbooks that match the ones on campus. I have 6 or 7,000 volumes in my lending library right now that we pack up each semester based on registration, roll in and roll back out and re-inventory. Not a function you normally do on campus, but that's my function of the bookstore as I think about a micro college. We have to do faculty recruiting. We have to do credentialing. Catherine talked a little bit about faculty recruiting. If I would not let a teacher teach on my main campus, I would not let them teach in any of my prison campuses. I'm not going to accept lesser than instructors in there. So I'm going to use the same credentialing, the same training, except more, because people inside are operating extremely independently in an environment with no supports for them or faculty. So they need more training to understand how to work successfully in that environment. Registration, enrollment management. Registration for us is, these are the courses we're going to be offering. What do you think you want? Oh, let's see how that would fit in your plan. But enrollment management, somebody wants to drop a course on campus, log in, drop. Can't do that outside or inside. So I have to have a process for paper requests for withdrawal. And that's very important if you're going to be a Title IV eligible institution inside with your program. If you need to know when people dropped, when people stopped attending, you have to maintain attendance records. You have to retention management. How are you going to do tutoring? We have a tutoring center on campus. What am I going to do to help the students inside? I actually have a partnership with my neighbor university, which is Princeton, and Princeton sends graduate students in as volunteers to run tutoring on Friday nights. And that's how we have tutoring for our students. Information resources are huge. When I need somebody to do a research paper for one of the classes on campus, they can go to the library. Oh, don't have a library. Or they can go on the internet. Don't have an internet. So we actually say, what topic of these 20 would you like to research for your paper? And we work with our library to build paper research packs that have some good quality academic research on that topic, some okay research, and some Wikipedia crap research. And the student has to learn how to filter through that paper research to emulate the process of good decision making with information literacy. Very laborious, but the only way we can replicate inside. Grade reports. Our students go on Banner and find their grades. I have to actually make report cards. It's cool. I feel like I'm back in elementary school, right? Remember, you guys are probably all too young, but I remember getting paper report cards and my parents having to sign them. I have to make paper report cards for my students and give them to them. I have to mock up term bills because I want them to know the value of the education. This is what it would cost, even though you're not getting a bill. This is how much Pell you received. If I had to RTT4, this is how much I gave back to the government. If you were short, this is how much we scholarship you for. Those are all manual bills that we create to support this program. Appeals management. On campus, if you want to appeal your grade, you're responsible for collecting all the information that you need for the appeal, and then come on down and we'll give you a little hearing. They can't collect it. They don't have that information typically. So we have to maintain copies of the work they've done. So if they feel their grade is unjust, I can go back and reclaim the work they did to help them build their appeal case, because they don't have the agency to do that themselves. Graduation management. We had the first graduation, formal cap and gown graduation, first college graduation in New Jersey in 2013. And, negotiating getting a record player with the DOC that could play Pomp and Circumstance was interesting. We actually negotiated and since have done this many times. CBS even covered a graduation with us last year. Cap and gown graduations, families invited, a little bit of a meal afterwards, outside speakers, student valedictory speakers. You have to build that ceremony for your students who are graduating. So I guess the message, and I'm not going to talk a lot more, is think about how you would take a college experience, all of the elements of it, and make a micro college that you can serve your inside students with, so that you're not leaving them out of any of the experience and value of the educational opportunity you offer your campus students. And I know we're running behind in the session. I don't want to take any more time, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. And been really looking at the transition of someone from being incarcerated to coming home, and what they're facing. What kind of support services should we kind of have for them in general? I'll ask Vanessa, do we have a hard stop, or can we keep going past the time, just to know how to gauge our time?
Yeah, so we'll continue as long as we need to, because obviously this is really great information. So thank you all for sharing so much. But for those that do need to get off at the hard stop time, please note that we will be sending out the recording along with the PowerPoint.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to talk about a program that we've been doing for a couple of months here at Mount SAC, and just the work that I've been doing throughout my educational career. My name is Joe Luis Hernandez. I am the coordinator for Rising Scholars, and I'm here with my colleague.
Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Felix, and I work with TRIO Student Support Services, as was previously mentioned earlier. And so I've been working alongside with Joe Lewis, just helping create and establish programs. And the bulk of what we're going to be talking about is really going to be centered around how do you work with individuals, with students who were formerly incarcerated, right? So now they're transitioned back to society and are trying to attend a higher institution. So that's really going to be what we're going to kind of switch gears from what Sheila and Catherine were focusing on, and talking about more how do we transition folks now who are home into higher education.
Next slide, please.
So what we're going to be covering is giving you just an overview of the data, what the data states, and then we're going to go into challenging the stigma on formerly incarcerated students, and then go highlight barriers that formerly incarcerated students may face. And then Joe's going to really highlight services for formerly incarcerated students specifically to be intentional in serving this populations. And then in just getting us thinking, right, what can your programs do if you're at an institution that doesn't have a specific program tailored to serve this population? What can you do, and some starting points? And then we'll wrap it up with the impact the TRIO program can make on formerly incarcerated students.
And in really engaging, I like to drop these numbers at the beginning about incarceration, just so like people can marinate on it and see what really are the effects, right? So in our country, we account for 5% of the world's population, but we account for 25% of the world's incarcerated population, with another 7.3 million people under supervision, right? Hawkins wrote about this in 2011, but I don't think anything has changed, right? It might have grown, but also a key thing that came out this year with Danny Murillo was that 95% of those that are currently incarcerated are going to come home at some point, right? And leads to my next point, is what recidivism is, right? In California, out of every 10 people released, 6 of them will return to jail within 3 years, right? And the Department of Justice estimates that 1/2 to 1/3 of those released will recidivate. Like, imagine those numbers, right? So only 4 people will find a way to stay out, and that's past the 3 years. That's usually what they measure it. And then really looking at what is the impact of incarceration on families, right? Forward.us found that 1 in 2 adults in the United States had experienced incarceration within their family, or knew somebody that was incarcerated. Next slide, please. And I set that information up for this next information, is like, how do we challenge the stigma on formerly incarcerated students, and what do we understand, right? And the importance of the programs that were recently talked about, right? Education, right? The impact of education on recidivism. For those that participate in education while incarcerated, the recidivism rate is 5% to 43%, right? So it lowers the recidivism rate. And then once they transition home and continue to pursue education, the recidivism lowers by another 20%, right? And really looking at recidivism within education, right? Those that have an associate's degree, recidivism rate of 13.7%, those with a bachelor's degree at 5.6%, and those with the master's or beyond right, have no recidivism. And then the work that I do, an anti-deficit perspective or strength-based perspective, really looking at how we can take the lived experience of these students, right, and see them as holders of knowledge, because oftentimes we look at students in a very deficit perspective of they don't know this, they don't know that, they can't do this, they can't do that, but they have this intimate knowledge of another system that they've experienced, which is incarceration and navigating it, right? So how does that, or navigating the streets, how does that help them in navigating higher education, right? How can we help them retool some of their own strengths or things that they talk. So I've been talking about the streetwise scholar identity, which leads them to success in higher education as viewed rather than unprepared. Like we just got to bring out the strength that they have, and then they'll be prepared. Next slide, please. So some of the barriers these students face, right? So there's two types of stigmas that I found in my research, and then in a lot of stuff that we do that students face is the external barrier, right? When a lot of your programs, they were talking about the difficulty of going into prisons to teach education. Now imagine what our risk people are saying on campus. I've gotten questions like, well, what do they want here? Or what do they want to do? Why are they here? And I like to tell people they ain't here. Like nobody got out of jail in 2021 and all of a sudden we're thinking like, I'm gonna go to school. Like they've been here for years, right? So really like the stigma of what they're facing, right? A lot of research shows that most crimes committed on campus are committed by first-time offenders rather than those that have been incarcerated. And then the internalized stigma, right? Because on the opposite end, a lot of students won't self-disclose about their experience for fear of being judged, right? What are you gonna think about, right? What, this gap in history or when I have specific credits from specific places, right? What are you gonna say about me? So a lot of students will not ask for help. I recently asked a question on our application at Mount SAC, and a little less than half of the students denied any assistance with their experience, right? They all answered yes to the experience, but a little less than half said, no, I don't want any assistance with personalized counseling, right? And so the question begs to ask, why is it that they would not want any extra assistance? And then also knowing, like Sheila was talking about, and they were talking about the familiarity with electronics. Sometimes their education is not electronically based, and now we have Zoom, we have PDFs, we have PowerPoints that we have to have students do. I think these are some of the things that might kind of come in as a barrier. And then basic skills, right? Remedial courses and stuff like that. Some students might not have had access to education while incarcerated, right? Some of these students, for me personally, some students might not participate in education while incarcerated, right? So then, some of these students might have years between they were in the last educational setting and some of them weren't, right? So I think it's not a generalizable experience that everybody participates in prison education, right? But, what might be the gaps that they face? Understanding of writing for scholarships. A lot of my students that I work with when it's scholarship season, they tend to write like, I have no barriers, there will be no barriers, I will succeed, right? And I tell them like, no, this scholarship really wants to hear about what did you overcome? They'll be like, no, there's no more things to overcome, right? So I think I got to teach them how to tell their stories so that they can show, depending on what scholarships is, lack of knowledge in navigating higher education, right? I have to retool sometimes for these students, some of their experiences on the streets or in jail, so that they could be able to like develop how to navigate higher education, how to find resources on campus, right? How to engage those resources, right? Because you can tell them how to find them, you can take them there to meet people, but also how to engage that resource after that initial introduction. And then I think the last one, for lack of a better term, is developing social skills, right? A lot of people that are incarcerated develop specific skills for survival that sometimes I have to mitigate with my students when they're telling me like, this person bumped into me and they didn't even say sorry, or they were looking at me, and I had to tell them like well, what are they looking at? And I have to like really engage with my students to like let them know that there's different, or sometimes when people talk to them in a specific tone, I still feel some type of way when people talk to me in a specific tone. So like I have to remember that my students might still get this kind of stuff, or when they're being told information that seems chastising, right? And that happens a lot in some classrooms when people misspeak or missay current trends in higher education, and somebody will tell them, no, you say it like this, right? And the student might be like, whoa, what are you talking about? And I think that's key in understanding that our students might face this, Next slide, please. So what are the services that I generally provide, right? And we're really looking at services for students. I think about services for students as a reverse pyramid, right? There's all these general services that, as Sheila was talking about, that we engage with the student, but you tailor them to the student, right? And it goes down to the specific population. So it's one-on-one assistance with college and financial aid applications. You know, like, I'm really glad that the selective service requirement is going to be removed, because that is a barrier that some students face. That wasn't a barrier I faced, but a lot of students will face a selective service, you know, verification. So how do you write the statement? How do you find out the information? Where do you get the information from? And really answering the question, right? Because a lot of people, there's this big myth about if you've been convicted of a crime, you can't receive the Pell Grant, right? But which is, sometimes people don't read the question all the way through. It says, have you been convicted of possession or drugs while receiving federal financial aid, right? I tell my students, the government just wants to make sure that only the CIA buys drugs with their money, you know, and really engaging them to understand that, you know, one-on-one educational counseling, like, what kind of classes can you get? What do you need for your major? And I think there was supporting them in their future, right? What is available for you beyond, I don't want to put down drug and alcohol counselors, but just drug and alcohol counseling, right? What is you beyond what you think that might be available for you? You know, so you look at what students can do, and then you look at the laws, right, in your state to see how you can help them. Assistance with applying to other programs, right? There was a question in the chat when we talked about veterans upward bound. Some of these students might be veterans, right? So then, can a veterans program on campus help them a little bit better? Some of these students have disabilities, right? Can we help them connect them to the disabilities students, like office? Or, you know, some of these students might have some mental health issues. Is there a mental health office on your campus that you can help the students with, right? Another one is community referrals. I'm not asking for you to be a social worker, but having an awareness of what's around your campus, right? There's a lot of substance abuse with formerly incarcerated students that comes with the lifestyle sometimes. So do you know any drug treatment centers? You know, in this semester, we had 4 of my students relapse, right? And some of them have had to go back to treatment centers. So do you have that working relationship? Workshops that focus on helping them acclimate to college and to the campus, and then workshops to provide them information that they might not know, right? Here in California, we have a lawyers association of formerly incarcerated lawyers that defend each other to pass the bar. So do we develop workshops for that? How do you develop success packets for rehabilitation certificates, general tutoring, and then connection to all other programs? Here in California, we're really lucky, right? Both of our 4-year university systems have programs, right? Like Project Rebound, which has been around for 50 years in the CSU system, and then Underground Scholars in the UC system. And Project Rebound is really, you know, it's been around for 50 years, right? And that was started by someone that was incarcerated. So having those connections and these various organizations, and then enrichment activities, right? Symphonies, live plays, you know, sporting events. I think those are some things that a lot of students haven't experienced. And when we bring them through an educational setting, like, give them that experience. And then what comes from behind the house, right? Like, what kind of careers come from different degrees? Next slide, please.
So, you know, as you're here listening to all the information that we're sharing, you're probably, some of us might have a specialized program already at your institution that is serving this population of formerly incarcerated system impacted students, which is great. But what happens when you don't have a specific program serving this specific population? And the perspective that I give is, I mean, I have 18 years of working in higher education, specifically with TRIO, Upward Bound, and then, you know, 11 years with TRIO Student Support Services. So 11 years ago, when I began my work with TRIO Student Support Services at Mount San Antonio College, that is in California, we didn't have 11 years ago, we didn't have a specific program to work again with the specific population of formerly incarcerated students. So the experience that I'm going to be sharing today is going to be really coming from a place of what I had to do as a TRIO program, as a faculty coordinator of a TRIO program, as students would self-disclose because I am a counselor. So in my counseling sessions, students would start to self-disclose. I was formerly incarcerated. My father's formerly, you know, is in prison, and things like that during our counseling session. So what I would do is I would encourage students to begin developing clubs to have a peer-to-peer mentoring support for one another. So, at our college, which is, I'm sure it's similar across the board at many universities and colleges, if you're a student organization on campus, you receive funding, you receive support. So that's always a good place to start. So I encourage my students, why don't you all develop a club? I'll be your advisor, right? So that's one way, is you can encourage students to mobilize and develop clubs and organize themselves. Another recommendation is to build campus awareness of student population. So every space that I was in at Mount SAC the last 11 years, I would highlight this population. I would talk about these students, right? Knowing that there wasn't a specific program, and just really asking the campus, what are we going to do to serve this population? Because as other folks have mentioned on the panel, this isn't, especially with you're working in higher education, this isn't a new group that's just going to come out of nowhere. This is a group that we have been on our campuses, attending our campuses. Some of them are already in our TRIO programs currently or in the past. So what are we doing to really advocate for their needs, right? Also developing intentional partnerships inside and outside of your institution, highlighting students to shatter stigmas. Every year, our Vice President of Student Services would ask a lot of our programs, and again, I'm representing TRIO Student Support Services, she would ask, for recommendations to highlight a student for the actual graduation every year. So I would be intentional in highlighting a student that was a formerly incarcerated student to amplify their voice at that point. So go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. So in thinking about the next steps, right, I already kind of shared what can be done at your campus, especially for those of us that do not have a formalized group to work with formerly incarcerated students, and that's that campus level. But I think at the national level, and just kind of the big picture, is continue checking in with COE, and just even having this workshop today and this webinar and all of you being here today, I think it's a testament, right, of that there's a lot more work that needs to be done, specifically, in supporting this group. But I think COE is a great place to continue having these conversations. And I know Joe Lewis and I, since last year, have been, meeting with Maureen and Angelica and folks from COE, just asking these questions. What more can we be doing to mobilize ourselves? Also, being informed of legislation that impacts students at a national level. So I know Rachel did an amazing job at the beginning, providing us all with some context on the second chance Pell. And so just knowing how does that apply to what can be done at your campus. So I understand that we're all, from all over the United States. And so just thinking about how does the information that you're hearing about today apply at your institution and apply for your students. But at the state level, like if you're thinking, okay, Diana, that's great at the national level, but let's kind of, bring it back down to my state, right? And thinking about your state, I think a great place for folks to start at would be our equity professional organizations. And some of us, because we're a TRIO, we are familiar with WestStop, which is our Western region. There's also MEAP, SEAP, and it could start with, going to those, to the leadership of these equity professional organizations and asking that question, what are we doing for formerly incarcerated students, and what more can we be doing for these groups? So I know we've already had these conversations and are having these conversations within WestStop, which is the professional organization that we're a part of over here in California, but that's another place that we can start. Advocating for formerly incarcerated and system impact to students. And, just thinking of all of the meetings that we're in, it's constantly, what I found in the last 10 years, our program, Rising Scholars, which Joe Lewis is the coordinator of, didn't get started till this September 2020, right? So officially, it's officially been a program just since September. So he has a year under his belt of here at Mount SAC in developing and creating this program. But for the last 10 years, I can tell you that every single year I had students that would self-disclose, right? So just want to reiterate that these students are not a new group that are going to just come all of a sudden, right, are being released all of a sudden. These students are on our campus. They've been on our campus. So it's really a matter of what are we doing and what more can we be doing for this population. And then the next, I will drop a resource in a minute in the chat. And it's a great resource that that's called Fostering Success for Formerly Incarcerated Students on Campus, and really looking at, you know, that more of that campus level support that we can provide these students. And I think because if you think about the populations that we serve within TRIO, first generation, low income, and or students with a disability, you know, I think when working with these students, a lot of these students, like I said earlier, will just self-disclose that they were formerly incarcerated. So for me, for the last 10 years, anytime a student would self-disclose that, I took it as an opportunity of, what more can I do for you? Let me help you in this additional way. Let me connect you here. I may have not been the expert in this, you know, working with population, but I had connections with Project Rebound, which is part of the Cal State University system. I had connections with Underground Scholars, which is part of the University of California system. So just being aware and that these organizations are out there, and just kind of mobilizing ourselves to organize ourselves. So next up, we're going to give some time to Joe Luis Hernandez to share his story, especially as a formerly incarcerated student individual himself, but how he has navigated and the impact specifically that TRIO had on his educational trajectory. So next slide, please, Vanessa. Thank you.
And thank you, Diana. Diana always wants to highlight my story, but I think it's not important so much as myself, but it's important what I represent. Right, who I represent when I'm in the room, and I don't think I ever get it twisted that like this was done just by myself, right? This was done, like I really love TRIO. If you could look at my sash, right, I put TRIO Works on it, right, because I believe in what TRIO has done for me, particularly as a student that has experienced community college in 2 iterations, right? As a student that I like to say, right, thought he had no place in higher education based on what he thought his life trajectory was, because of where I've lived, because of how I grew up, and because of what I experienced, right? And really looking at my own incarceration experience. When we talk about formerly incarcerated student programs, I tell a lot of my bosses, I got a better onboarding when I went to jail than I did when I came to Mount SAC, right? You know, my first time incarcerated, they gave me all the rules to the house. They told me what to do, told me what not to do. They told me this was gonna happen if you did this, right? And it was funny, right? Because I left, I got out, and then I was reincarcerated again. And then the second time that I was reincarcerated, I was already being talked about this transfer process, right? About what do you do when you get to the state penitentiary? What are the rules at the state penitentiary? So I was already being engaged, right, from the county jail, and taught how I was going to be successful in the prison system, right? And what I was going to do when I got to the prison system, and how I was going to act when I got to the prison system. But for me as a student, my first time at Mount SAC, nobody told me that. Right? Nobody told me that you use this office for this, you use this office for that. You know, you go to EOPS, you go to TRIO, you go to Access, the Office for Students with Disabilities. And I was just basically told from my drug and alcohol counselor, you could go to school and find success. But nobody told me how to find success. You know, and it wasn't until I dropped out, you know, I came back to school in 2012. And I was really introduced to Diana through the EOPS program at Mount SAC. And this is why, like, it's crucial for me to say, like, yes, some of your programs do serve formerly incarcerated students. And yes, some of your programs do touch on the student population, but the service is not intentional, right? The service is not geared at some of these student experiences, because yet Diana knew when I disclosed to her, right, that I had been incarcerated, you know, when she was talking to me about writing a thesis. She was talking to me about, you know, working at a community college. And I told her, lady, I got gun cases. Ain't nobody gonna hire me at a community college, right? Like, I got felonies. And she was like, yes, you are. Don't worry about it. And I think for me, being critical, but seeing that she believed in me is what I really latched onto. And I think as I progressed in my education, it was the understanding that I had that there was no place for me in higher education. But because I didn't understand the laws, and I didn't understand what now I teach to my students, right? What I teach to my students about expungements, what I teach to my students about answering questions on applications, what I teach to my students about their rights, and understanding what it is. And so as I navigated higher education, like, I kind of went on this, like, a hope and a prayer that I might get a job, you know. And it wasn't until I was in my master's degree that I began to work on a lot of programs, like at Rio Hondo College with Rise Scholars in it. And even in that, I always remember something that Diana told me: when you want to work with somebody that has a big heart for students, always work with a TRIO professional. Because at Rio Hondo, I worked with Cecilia Rocha and I worked with Heba Griffiths, who were key and instrumental in helping me develop and implement programs, and taught me, right? And advocated for me when people wanted to be like, well, why are we going to hire him? He has a criminal record, right? And I think that's what comes as TRIO professionals in different capacities is how do you advocate for students? How do you advocate for students to have jobs on campus? And for me, it was really key when I got all this information and then being successful, because like, if you think about it, I'm in a PhD program today because, and I do research today because Diana believed in me, right? I was happy with getting a certificate and working at some department in the state of California that was very entry level. And because that's what they told me that I could do, you know, they said that they only do a 10-year background check. I was like, cool, because by the time I get this associate's degree, it'll have already been 10 years since I was incarcerated. So it's not even gonna come up, right? And that's all I can ever do. And you know, now as I work at Mount Sac, and I'm a manager on campus, right? Like I'm an academic manager. I control what happens inside of my program, right? Like I'm able to advocate. I sit right with the vice president, right? I get to have direct impact on what these students do. And that's something I never thought that was going to be available for me, right? Because of my own internalized stigma. And even today, when you know, people like Heba and Diana are like, you could be a vice president and you can be a dean and you can be this, like, I'm like, y'all are crazy, because who's going to hire me, right? People will tell me like, oh, you could be a professor. And I know professors that have been incarcerated, but there's still some reach for me that I don't feel like I can attain, right? And so I think it's very key that when we talk about these beliefs in these students and what they can accomplish, right? And continuing to move them beyond, like, I don't tell my students when they're like, I'm just gonna get a certificate. I guess because Diana ingrained transfer, I'm like, get an associate's degree. Don't just get in a certificate. And if you choose to be done after that associate's degree, then then you can graduate and you're done. But when you wanna go up higher and you wanna get a bachelor's degree, you don't have to come back and finish all these courses. And I think for me, it's really key to just understand that I don't represent myself in these spaces, right? Particularly when I'm on panels, when I speak, because like, yes, I've done, you know, some good stuff, but it is also because I have a community behind me, right? I have other formerly incarcerated students, like my friend Irene Sotelo, who is the coordinator for Project Rebound at Cal State Long Beach, right? Which is the you know, and all these people that I know across, you know, the state of California and across the country, right? Because now I got a mentor who's gonna go to Texas, and she's gonna start doing research on formerly incarcerated students in Texas, right? And advocating for us. And I think that's the most important thing that I saw TRIO programs do, is advocate for us. You know, I'm really grateful for this experience, man. I hope that COE picks up this task force, right? And that there is some form of programming that is done intentionally for formerly incarcerated students to really assist them and creating advocacy for students in particular, man. And thank you for just letting me share a little bit about myself. Next slide, please. And this is our contact information. If you would like to email us or have any questions or need any help. I really know what it is for when I have questions about formerly incarcerated student programs, for other formerly incarcerated student programs, to ignore my emails, right? So if you email me, I will try my best to get back to you. So don't be afraid to reach out, or if you have any students that need to know anybody, I'm really here to help others.
Thank you so much. There are a few questions in the chat box. And I see that there were some questions that were already answered, so thank you so much. There is a question about, are formerly incarcerated individuals eligible for Division of Vocational Rehab? I can't tell from their website if they are. It would be a great additional resource since many have a disability. DVR can be a great support for eligible TRIO students. Any thoughts or comments?
I can talk to that one. So in California, we have Department of Rehabilitation, which I'm believing is similar. So they look at substance abuse as a requirement for rehabilitation, but also they're looking at now as post-traumatic disorder as a result of being incarcerated. And so really letting the students know how to advocate based on the various things, because there was an iteration where I went to a student with disabilities program and they were like, oh, you were just an addict? What else do you have? And I wanted to be like, so addiction itself, right, is not bad. But I think teaching our students to advocate, and the Department of Rehabilitation really looks at the different forms of disabilities or impacts that incarceration has. So yes, I believe they would qualify.
Great, thank you. The next one is, how can we help students pass graduation? Do we have resources that we can refer them to that may encourage them in their journey of post-incarceration?
I could take, or Sheila, you want to tackle that one?
I'm just going to talk globally because it varies so much by state. Almost every state has a network of reentry organizations. Some of them are educationally based. Many are faith-based throughout the country. There are some that are governmentally based and others that are philanthropically based. And I think depending on the state you're in, if you do a search for reentry support with the name of your state, you'll likely get some hits. If you can't find a resource in your state, we do, as practitioners, have a network of people. And I think if you email or contact one of us, we try to help you find one in your state. It's just, it's so state dependent. There's not a good national reentry network. Diana, you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I was gonna say that the main thing that I do when I transfer a student from the 2-year, which is my institution, and hand them over to a 4-year, right? Transfer them over to 4 years so they can graduate and transfer, is, you know, call our TRIO folks, right, at that institution and to receive that student. So I would say, if all else, because TRIO is a very, I think, mobilized national network, and we're everywhere in the United States. And I think starting there, right, I think that's what I do when I've had a student, and let's say I can't find a resource specifically like a reentry program or anything at that institution, I will then contact, you know, a McNair Scholars TRIO program, an EOC, you know, TRIO program, an EOP, which is a state funded over here, educational opportunity program. But I think a lot of it is maybe even starting at that TRIO level. So that's a good starting point, just to assess what do they have at that institution that you can refer your student to.
Also, I would add, is there any formerly incarcerated students in your state, right, that are vocal about their experience, right? Because through my time now, I've run into a lot of people now that have been formerly incarcerated and are in varying positions that you're like, wait, there was no Fair Chance Hiring Act then. How did you get that job? Right. And I think it's very key to understand that, like, I know a guy in the 90s that worked at a school as a psychologist, but was incarcerated during the 80s. Right. But I think it's very to understand that we tell our students no, but there are certain things that students can do to kind of find, you know, the wiggle room. There's been a lot of people wiggling around that have found positions, a lot of professors, a lot of, you know, people that before, because now it's kind of cool to say you were formerly incarcerated, right? Because in higher education, it's the flavor of the month. But I think these people have been around for a couple of years and they've been successful. So tapping into those networks, right? Like, what were the things that, how did they answer their questions, right? Like how, you know, I tell my students, as you work at a federal work study job at your campus, now you begin to get more work and more work. And then you were like, well, I got an associate. I got a recent question when they were asking me to write a statement of rehabilitation, right? They were like, we just want you to write a statement of rehabilitation. I was like, I'm in a PhD program. Did I not tell you anything? And they were like, no, we just need to, you know, so I think it's just preparing our students, because there is going to be some BS that's going to come up for them. And I don't sugarcoat it for them, but I tell them, like, this is how you combat that. Because for me, working in community colleges, they're governed by educational code. So there's going to be state law and educational code that might impact each other, but how do we advocate for ourselves?
If I can also weigh in just briefly, I actually work for the employment Security Department here in Washington State. And I would say post-graduation also don't, depending on the state, don't discredit some of the state agencies that may have staff on board who are specifically tasked with assisting people with records, whether it's employment or I can say that when I was working in release preparation that there were a number of contacts that I made who were able to provide information and support and navigation through systems like at the Division of Child Support, at the Employment Security Department, other community resources that would help with similar barriers to stability that just overlap with having a criminal history. So if it's low income or addiction history or non-consecutive employment history, those kinds of things. So don't make sure that you're also looking at the state agencies, because of course there also is the they need to meet the equity standards for their operation and funding. So they should be supportive of everyone. So thank you.
Great. I don't see any other questions in the chat box, or sorry, in the Q&A box, but I do see over in the chat box that they are saying, thank you for sharing your story, and that TRIO works. So great. So if there are no other questions, we just want to thank you all for being here today. And thank you again. This recording will be sent out along with the PowerPoint materials and the resources that were shared in the chat. So thank you again, and we will all chat soon.